Sri Lanka plans to bring back the death penalty for drug dealers. The government says it's stealing a page from the Philippines. But what does it mean for human rights? I'm Alijan Ayanash, and today's newsmaker is Sri Lanka's war on drugs. Sri Lanka plans to end its long-standing moratorium on capital punishment. President Maithripala Sirisena says convicted drug dealers are still doing business from prison, and he says he'll sign legislation to execute them. The country hasn't put to death a prisoner since 1976, but the war on drugs in the Philippines has inspired them to overhaul their judicial system. Sri Lankan officials have reportedly said they want to replicate Manila's hardline policies. Those include not just the death penalty, but also deploying the military and basically ignoring extrajudicial killings of suspects who haven't been convicted. International organizations say these actions amount to human rights abuses and fear that Sri Lanka is headed down the same path. With more on this, here's Haider Abbasi.
This is the biggest seizure of cocaine in Asia. There's nearly a ton in these bags. According to Sri Lanka's security agencies, it has a street value of $108 million. Now this man is cracking down. President Maithripala Sirisena says he'll bring back the death penalty for drug offences. Sri Lanka stopped executing convicts in 1976. But Sirisena says there needs to be a tougher approach to what he calls a rise in drug-related crime. Between 2015 and April of this year, Sri Lanka says it seized nearly 600 kilograms of heroin, around 17,500 kilograms of hashish, and 1,800 kilograms of cocaine. The government says convicted traffickers are arranging drug deals from behind bars. Sri Lanka has 19 drug offenders who are serving life sentences in prison. Authorities are now considering whether they should be executed. Ministers say the country is becoming a major transit hub for trafficking cocaine. But there's been a backlash against the decision to execute drug dealers. The European Union has urged Sri Lanka to reverse the decision. And the human rights group Amnesty International says there is no evidence that the death penalty has a unique deterrent effect against crime. Executions are never the solution, and for drug-related offences constitute a violation of international law. But Sri Lanka's government isn't discouraged. It says the military will be deployed to tackle drug-related crime. Sri Lanka is the latest country in Asia to take this approach. Since Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte began his war on drugs in 2016, at least 4,200 drug suspects have been killed. And rights groups say that number could be much higher. Sri Lanka says it wants to replicate Duterte's operation. And since Bangladesh began its drive against traffickers in May, at least 200 suspects have been killed and 25,000 detained. So if Sri Lanka adopts this model, is there a risk that innocent people could be killed? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Colombo is Jehan Pereira. He's the Research and Media Director of the National Peace Council of Sri Lanka. In Islamabad, Omar Warij, he's the Amnesty International's Deputy Director for South Asia. And in Washington, D.C., we have John Lott. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. John Lott, let me begin with you. Is bringing back the death penalty the best way to tackle a country's drug problem?
Well, it's a very effective way to deter criminals from committing crimes. You know, the issue that you have with drugs is just extremely difficult to stop them. The United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to stop illegal drugs coming in the United States, and I can't say that we've been particularly effective in doing that.
Okay.
The question is, if you're going to have those laws and going to try to stop them, what will be the most effective penalties to go and deter them? And the death penalty is an extremely effective method of deterring criminals.
So would you say that a stronger deterrent makes for a stronger country, a stronger society?
Look, drugs are a tough issue in the sense that when you make them illegal, you're going to create drug gangs and other groups that are going to specialize in trafficking them. I think there's an argument to be made for legalization, but if you do that, you're going to have more drug use. And so it's not nirvana. You basically have a choice between having lots of drug gangs, which are going to fight against each other to control drug turf and violent crime that results from that, or you're going to end up having more people using the drugs as the price goes down.
Okay, let me just switch over to Omar for a second. You believe that executions are not a show of strength, they're not a strong deterrent, but that it represents sort of the failure of a more humane society, correct?
Yes, executions actually aren't an effective deterrent. There's been lots of research done on this. I'm actually really quite surprised by what your guest said, where criminologists have, in study after study, demonstrated, and not least in the United States, so he should really be aware of this, that the death penalty is not a uniquely effective deterrent. Okay? This is just indisputable fact. Let me give you the example. And when it comes, by the way, to drug-related offenses, it is unlawful. It is a violation of international law to execute someone for drug-related offenses. We have examples of this. You don't have to look very far. In country after country, where we have seen that these coercive practices do not work. In this case, the death penalty is actually a very, very brutal practice. You're talking about putting people to death for drug-related offenses. Now, what President Sirisena has proposed in Sri Lanka, the problem that he has raised is actually one of the prison system. If he is saying drug trafficking is taking place in Sri Lankan prisons, that's a failure of the government. That is a failure of the prison authorities. In Iran, let's just look at the examples where there is high drug trafficking and high drug consumption. Iran has executed thousands of people, which I'd like your guests to actually go and have a look at. Thousands of people in grossly unfair trials, the vast majority of them for drug-related offenses, and the authorities have conceded that it has failed to produce a deterrent effect. There is no evidence that this is a deterrent effect. More than that, it is illegal under international law.
Okay, Omar and John, I see there's an interesting debate going on here, but I really want to bring Jihan in because he's also the third panelist in this. I mean, John, let me ask you, do you believe that the Sri Lankan government will actually go through with this and push this proposed law through?
My guess is that it will not happen. It is at the president's discretion because the president has the authority to reinstate or to activate the death penalty. The death penalty is in our law, but it has not been utilized by government since 1976. Now, the question is whether the president will actually go ahead because he has not shown himself to be very decisive over the last 3 years. One reason being that he heads a government in which there are two major parties, and these two major parties don't agree very much on many things. So whether he can get the support of his government is a question mark.
Okay, we're going to see that, but let me turn back to John for a second and let you respond to Omar. Basically, Omar had said that scientific studies have consistently failed to demonstrate that executions actually do deter from people committing these types of crimes. So what's your response to that?
I mean, people can go to our website, crimeresearch.org. There's a long list of academic studies. In fact, the vast majority finds that for each execution, for example, the average effect is about 8 fewer murders that you're going to see.
Hold on a second.
We see this all the time.
There is no death penalty in the U.S., so what are you basing your studies on? There's no death penalty for drug-related crimes in the U.S. For drug-related crimes. Okay, there haven't been executions for drug-related crimes in the U.S. So where are you coming up with this?
I'm saying generally the death penalty, if you look at crimes like murder,
on drug-related crimes. That's
deterrent.
what the question is here.
Okay.
Excuse me, 1 second, sir. 1 second, sir. When it comes to drug-related crimes, it is a violation of international law to execute people. You don't have that in the U.S., so where are you coming up with this?
With related to drug-related crimes,
I'm telling
John
you,
Lott, your response?
if you look at the effect of the death penalty on murders, the death penalty is an extremely effective deterrent there, and that's what I was referring to.
It's not
Okay,
an effective deterrent.
you know,
It is not
you
a
see
uniquely
all
effective
the time,
deterrent. First
and
of all, you need to make the distinction.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay.
Look, I'm just telling you, you can go, we have a list of papers. It's something like about 85% of the peer-reviewed academic journal studies find that, if you look at economists and criminologists, find that the death penalty deters murders.
All right.
And it deters some other types of violent crimes.
As this
And
debate
so,
between
look,
you two
and
goes
it
on,
not only does that,
let
but
me
it
just
also
bring back,
saves
let me
money.
bring our guest from Colombo, Jehan.
Well, he spoke most of the
in terms
time.
of doctrine, isn't the death penalty sort of inconsistent with Buddhist teaching?
Yes, it is inconsistent with Buddhist teaching. I think it will also be inconsistent maybe with the teachings of other religions. But people think that in the real world, it actually is a deterrent, and probably it is a deterrent. I have not really done much research on this, but I guess it's a deterrent. The issue in Sri Lanka, however, is that probably, politically speaking, it will not go through because even the opposition is opposing it. We are worried. We have just come out of a long civil war in which there were a lot of killings, and we are before the UN Human Rights Council on and accused of war crimes and asked to go through a transitional justice process. Now, reinstating the death penalty at this time, when we are trying to reconcile, when we are trying to get out of a situation where there were so many killings in the past, I don't think it is going to really fly with the political leaders, because there would be a fear that once the death penalty is unleashed, at the moment for drug-related offenses, but it can then be extended to other things as well, because we do have the death penalty on the books, in the law books.
Okay.
So my guess is it will not happen.
All right. John Law, let me turn back to you. And I understand that you're sort of making your comparisons with regards to capital punishment in the United States. Let's actually try to broaden our horizons, actually put Sri Lanka into perspective. The Sri Lankan government has said that it wants to sort of replicate the success of the Philippines. But the reality is what we're seeing in the Philippines are tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings. Won't this sort of open the door to a very slippery slope?
Well, it's not obvious to me. I mean, I hope people can differentiate using that type of penalty against somebody who's gone through the legal process and been convicted versus essentially having, a dictatorial type government there where, just on orders, somebody can be executed. So, I mean, either you have the rule of law or you don't have the rule of law. And that seems like a pretty bright dividing line. It's not obvious to me. I mean, the United States allows executions. That doesn't mean you have governors going and sending out hit squads to go and knock off people who they think are involved in the crime. If a governor in the United States tried to do something like that, he'd be in prison.
Okay.
So I think there's a pretty sharp line there.
Okay.
But I just want to say, I mean, we see the deterrent effect in many ways. You look at plea bargaining. There are many times that in order to not have to go through a trial, a prosecutor will say, look, I'll take the death penalty off the table if you plead guilty to first-degree murder. And lots of court cases that would have been going through and taking up lots of resources are settled because the prisoner there, the criminal, wants to avoid any possibility of having to face the death penalty. You see the deterrent in many ways.
All right, Omar, I want to turn back to you. John was actually talking about sort of the rule of law and sort of the complexities of the U.S. judicial system. But don't you think when you take it from a look at Sri Lanka, we've seen this in the Philippines, that these actions, this law could potentially lead the police to quickly assuming the role of sort of judge, jury, and executioner?
Right, so a couple of things here. First of all, if you're talking about the rule of law, I'd ask your guests to recognize the fact that executing people for drug-related offenses is a violation of international law. It just is. When it comes to the question of deterrence, I'm not saying it's not a deterrent at all. What I said was it is not a uniquely effective deterrent. There are other ways in which you can successfully deter people without putting them to death, such as life imprisonment. That's what the studies have showed. No studies show that actually executions are the only way. Uniquely effective. There have been studies done on this, on the comparison between Hong Kong and Singapore.
Nobody said it was uniquely. I just said it was more effective.
Well, no, what I'm saying is it's not uniquely effective.
I just said you have a greater
there are more
deterrent
humane
effect.
ways to do this, okay? When it comes to drug-related offenses, sir, it is a violation of international law. So if we're interested in the rule of law, I think we should actually have a look at those commitments as well.
Okay.
On your point, when it comes to EJEs, extrajudicial executions, that is not using the laws, it's doing away with the law altogether. This is a recipe for disaster. I'm surprised that actually this example of the Philippines was shared amongst the Sri Lankan authorities. Probably I have to give them benefit of the doubt without actually looking into the issue a great deal. What we have seen in the Philippines is thousands upon thousands of people killed. Most of these people are, like with the death penalty, by the way, from the poorest sections of society. These are people who have not been even given a trial, let alone the chance to defend themselves in any sort of way. And so this is the police doing away with the law, breaking the very laws they're supposed to uphold, and unleashing the sorts of violence that has not been successful by any measure. In fact, it has led to an investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Courts.
Okay,
with
Omar,
human rights groups like Amnesty
I'm
International.
running out of time, but actually I want to get back, Jehan, in
just
just a minute. I mean, why is Sri Lanka, the country, actually debating this in the first place? I mean, how big is the drug problem in Sri Lanka? And it's decided to actually consider these measures.
Well, it is a problem. Sri Lanka is believed to be a transshipment point, but I don't think it is that much of a issue. It is an issue, but the reason why I think the president has decided to say that he's going to restart executing people is because there is blame against him for not being a very strong leader. So I think he wants to show that he is politically strong, but actually in the end he will end up not being able to deliver on what he's saying.
Okay, John Lott, my last question to you is that Omar is saying that it is illegal under international law to sort of enforce capital punishment when it comes to drugs. Isn't this a violation of human rights?
Look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist. I deal with data. I can tell you what's the more effective types of penalties that are there. You know, with regard to human rights, I guess the question you have to face is their trade-offs. You know, you have the people who are being harmed by the drug trade that's there. You know, people being killed by drug gangs going and fighting against each other to go and control drug turf. And so politicians have to make a judgment over what types of penalties they can have to save lives for people who are harmed by the drug trade versus you know, what types of penalties you want to put on criminals.
Sir, you cannot save lives by putting people to death.
Okay, Omar, I'm going to give you the last word.
You have a crime, you have murders, and you can deter murders. You save lives if there are fewer murders. That's what deterrence does.
John Lott, Omar Warrage, and Jehan Pereira, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. It is an interesting debate, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Thank you, though. Still to come on the Newsmakers. Could the world's biggest free trade deal be a game changer in the global economy? And Australian politicians connect this woman's death to so-called African gang violence. We discuss why many say the government's claims are political. French cheese is now flowing tax-free to Tokyo, while Honda sports cars are cruising around Berlin without a tariff in sight. It's all due to the world's biggest free trade deal signed between the European Union and Japan. And the economic consequences are massive. 600 million people are affected, and more than a third of global GDP. Left out of the agreement, Donald Trump, who has triggered trade wars against Europe, China, Canada, and Mexico. So, are we seeing a new world order when it comes to the global economy? We'll debate that in just a moment, but first, here's this report by Christine Pirovarakis.
The European Union and Japan have signed one of the world's biggest free trade agreements, but the U.S. wasn't at the table. The agreement will create a market of 600 million people and will remove tariffs from imports and exports such as electronics, cars, wines, and cheeses. Better access to the Japanese market means European companies will save more than $1 billion a year. The deal appears to send the message that while President Donald Trump pulls the U.S. out of the global economy, other countries are not afraid to step in.
The impact of today's agreement goes far beyond our shores. Together, we are making, by signing this agreement, a statement about the future of free and fair trade. We are showing that we are stronger and better off when we work together.
Trump dumped the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement days after taking office and has threatened to walk away from NAFTA, a trade deal between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And as part of his America First policy, he slapped tariffs on Chinese goods, as well as steel, which both the EU and Japan export to the U.S.
And we're going to have trade, but we're going to have one-on-one. And if somebody misbehaves, we're going to send them a letter of termination, 30 days, and they'll either straighten it out or we're gone.
But it seems free trade is moving forward, with or without the U.S. In March, 11 Asia-Pacific countries signed a trade pact to lower tariffs. And negotiations are underway on yet another regional trade agreement. 16 countries are set to sign on, including China, Japan, Australia, and India. Trump appears to be willing to pull the U.S. out of trade deals that he thinks do not benefit American workers and corporations. But by doing so, will the U.S. get left behind? Christine Pirovarakis, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Tokyo is Michito Tsuruoka. He's a research fellow at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research. In Washington is Raleigh Walters, who is a policy analyst specializing in Asian economies at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. And finally, we have Michael Johns in Philadelphia, who is a co-founder of the conservative Tea Party movement. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Michito, let me start with you. This is a massive deal. It covers nearly a third of the global GDP. What does it mean when you have protectionist measures that are gaining steam globally for this deal to go through now?
Yes, the EU-Japan EPA, the FTA and EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, yes, that was signed in a very perfect timing. So as you said, that now the level of concern is getting really high about Trump administration's protectionist rhetoric and protectionist measures. So this was very much a good demonstration that the idea of free trade is still alive. So the EU and Japan, yes, occupies around 30% of world GDP and also world trade. So this is the actually biggest trade deal ever done. So this is I think the EU and Japan were able to give a very strong message to the world, particularly in light of what's been taking place by the Trump administration and in the international trade scene. So symbolic terms, yes, this is really good. And also in substantial terms, and this is a very serious major deal.
Okay. Michael Johns, no doubt this is a major endorsement when it comes to the global trading system. Does the U.S. even care?
Well, of course we do. And I think what's constructive about it is it's a move both by the EU and by Japan in the direction of free trade, which is also the long-standing objective of this country. And unfortunately, we've been victimized by some very unfair treatment by trading partners around the world. But if this, as I believe will be the case, ultimately leads to an acceleration of economic growth in the EU and in Japan, as you correctly say, it's a third of the global economy, that's hugely constructive for all economies of the world, and thus something that should be celebrated. It also sends, I think, an important message to the world that the future is in free trade, not in tariffs and in protectionism and currency manipulations and other impediments to trade. This is, so for the most part, this is a hugely constructive development for the world.
Okay. Riley Walters, does this deal look like it will sort of dampen the pinch that was brought on by the U.S. tariffs?
I don't think it will necessarily change the way that the administration right now is applying the tariffs. I know that the EU Commissioner President is supposed to be here tomorrow in Washington to talk about some of these tariff issues. I think it is fortunate that the EU and Japan were able to sign this long negotiated trade deal for now. And it certainly gives the EU and Japan a bit of a leverage in sort of international trade negotiations. But I can't imagine the EU or US coming to any trade deal anytime soon.
Okay. Michito, let me talk to you. You talked about the timing in terms of when it compares to other tariffs brought on by the Trump administration. Do you think this is sort of a retaliatory message in terms of an attempt to neutralize the effects brought on by these tariffs?
I think it was just a coincidence because the EU and Japan have been negotiating this agreement for 5 years, and it was agreed in principle last year. So the fact that we have just signed this agreement was just a coincidence. But in hindsight, the timing was very perfect. But in terms of a global trade regime or governance in the world, then this is really important that showing that EU and Japan can play a very constructive, productive role in maintaining the international trade order. So that's really the strategic importance of this has increased quite a lot over the past several months, particularly because of what the Trump administration has been doing.
Okay, so a constructive and strategic partnership between the European Union and Japan. Michael Johns, let me turn back to you. I think you would agree when I say we're definitely at a crossroads when it comes to global trade. Do you think deals like this, deals that exclude the United States, sort of endanger the U.S.'s position as the leader in global trade?
I don't, and here's why. I mean, the Japanese and EU economies have been largely stagnant, and that has been to the detriment of our exports into the region. It's not the only impediment to our growth and to our exports, but it has been an impediment. So I think the position being that free trade generally is stimulative to economic growth. These are two country and region of the world that very much need it. I think it also, is at least one victory for the EU in the sense that there is a growing level of concern that the EU is not delivering on promises and commitments that it made, that this network of countries was going to transform and help lead Europe into a leadership position. The United States far and away leads the world in our economic position and our GDP by every metric. And to the extent this agreement is stimulative to the Japanese and EU economies, that's only constructive to the United States.
Okay, Riley Walters, Michael says that it's not going to dethrone sort of the king of the hill, but paint me a picture for 5-10 years from now. I mean, are we going to see, generally when you look at global trade, the latecomers to the game are usually the ones that have the least options. And we've seen this with the United States, whether it's with NAFTA or with the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Do you think the U.S. might perhaps regret sort of not playing a more active role in this new era of global trade?
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, Michael's right in that the EU and Japan sorely need sort of more free trade at this time to help boost their economies. What this deal means is essentially that over the next 5 to 10 years, the two countries, the companies within them, the individuals, the EU is of course a culmination of various different countries themselves with significant comparative advantages in the things that they make. Over the next 5 years, they'll start building institutional systems for trade, supply chains, things that'll be very hard for the United States to displace one day when we sort of come back to the table and with the things that we're very good at. One concern I think would be in the agricultural area. Obviously, the EU and Japan have agriculture as a very certain. It's locked in their hearts in a very certain area, and so those will be hard to crack one day. And that's one thing I think most Americans would like to see more of is more agricultural exports.
Okay. Michito, let me turn back to you. I mean, talk to me about the real motives behind this deal, because one could say this is straight out of the page from Abenomics in terms of because of the Japanese economy relying so heavily on exports and perhaps the Prime Minister's desire to sort of stimulate the local economy by increasing consumerism.
Yes, of course, concluding various FTAs, not just with the EU, is part of a what is called Abenomics. So the boosting economy, in terms of boosting economy, yes, the concluding agreements is really important. But the EU is just one piece of this bigger picture, because Japan very much liked wanted the United States to remain in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and as a result of the U.S. withdrawal from that deal, Japan has been pushing the TPP 11 without the United States, and Japan played a very big role in concluding that agreement, and Japanese Parliament, the Diet, has already ratified that. So we very much expect the Americans to come back this sort of a multilateral framework in the Asia-Pacific region as well. So the FTA with the EU is part of such a big picture.
Okay. Michael Johns, let me turn back to you. I mean, one of, Michito talked about the Trans-Pacific Agreement. One of President Donald Trump's first actions was to withdraw the United States from this agreement. And now it's with the introduction of tariffs. Aren't U.S. consumers, aren't U.S. manufacturers going to be hurt in the long run with all this?
I don't think so. I think the president is generally on the right path as it relates to the future of our trade policy. There's a lot of concerns about details and complexities of multilateral and multinational trade agreements. We haven't necessarily had the greatest experience in any of them, including, as the president has pointed out, in NAFTA. So I think what we're striving for now is more of an expansion of bilateral trade agreements with specific countries, and very much, I think, rooted on what essentially Japan and the EU have just completed, and that is, in this case, I think an agreement that's largely like 99% free trade. Very few products are excluded from it, and that, as the president has correctly, I think, pointed to, is where we want to get our foreign trade policies and our foreign trade agreements structured. Doing that in a bilateral way is many times easier than doing it in a multilateral way.
Okay, Riley Walters, I saw you smile there when Michael said that the U.S. consumer is not going to be hurt. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I disagree. I mean, again, as other countries like Japan, I think Japan is actually taking the lead in a lot of this. As they negotiate new free trade deals, again, the U.S. is going to be missing out in the short term. And you could argue it's the short-term cost for long-term benefits, but those long-term benefits might not be 10, 20 years down the road. I mean, this administration is very keen on negotiating new bilateral trade deals, but at this moment, we haven't seen any. Japan doesn't really want to negotiate a bilateral trade deal with the United States. Other countries have been reluctant as well, and what we've seen from this administration isn't really a sort of a coming to the table to actually negotiate with countries on these trade deals. It's more of a demand, readdressing old trade deals to quote unquote make them better. I'm skeptical of sort of this free trade mentality, whether it's actually there or not, and whether we actually will have more free trade agreements.
Okay, my last question to all of you. President Donald Trump often referred to China, 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 even in the run-up to the election. How does China benefit from this deal between Japan and the European Union? Michito, let's start with you.
The EU-Japan FTA is not particularly about China. So from our point of view, the TPP was somewhat about China. So because the TPP was very much about building international norms and international trade norms and international rules, regulations, and so the Japan, the United States, and other countries are really eager to take the lead in rule-making in the Asia-Pacific region. But the FTA between the EU and Japan, it's very much about the EU and Japan, and also it's as I said, that this is really a good strategic message, but how it is perceived by Beijing, that's something that we don't particularly. We are not particularly concerned about.
Michael Johns, I want your final comments on this new
particularly
trade deal.
For decades, China has been getting away with one of the biggest heists in the history of global trade. The president is correct in pointing out that the manipulation of the yuan, their theft of intellectual property, their requirement of joint ventures, their own tariffs and impediments to U.S. exports has gotten in the way of trade relationships with the U.S. and with the rest of the world. And I think China really has to have an awakening right now that if it's going to be, as it needs to be as an export-driven economy, a central part of the global economy, it's going to have to address those issues. And I believe the president's forcing that question and must force it. And no one's a fan of tariffs. But if that's what it takes to get China to the negotiating table, we can't sit around until a $350 billion trade deficit explodes to $500 billion or ultimately $1 trillion. I think the president's right in forcing the issue right now, and I think we are in the driver's seat and in a position to be able to negotiate a more favorable relationship and a more even playing field.
Gentlemen, thank you for trading words here on the Newsmakers. I appreciate your time. Australia's Prime Minister has warned the public that Sudanese gangs are on the prowl in Melbourne. This past weekend, the Home Affairs Minister suggested they were to blame for the death of a 19-year-old woman named La Chol. But activists in the African Australian community say Chol wasn't a victim of gang violence. Instead, they accused Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull of inciting racial discrimination. In fact, police say she was killed during a domestic altercation at a party. So, is this race baiting to score political points or just disregarding political correctness to call it what it is? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Melbourne by Kevin Bailey. He's from the Australian Conservatives Party and a Senate candidate for the state of Victoria. Also in Melbourne is Ring Mayar. He's the chairman of the South Sudanese Community Association of Victoria. Gentlemen, welcome to the both of you to Newsmakers. Kevin Bailey, let me start off with you. Now, you support Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's comments about the Australian government needing to address this issue, but do you agree with all of his comments, specifically when he said that there is a, quote, real concern about the Sudanese gangs and that you have to be walking around with your hands over your ears in Melbourne not to hear it?
Unfortunately, yes, there is a real problem, not with all of the Sudanese community, of course, but with the fact that there is a large percentage, a much larger percentage of aggravated crimes, aggravated robberies, and gang activity than is equal to their representative status in the community. So, you know, we need to actually address it. We need to look at it, and we need to not be afraid because of political correctness, not to call something what it is.
Okay, well, I'm going to get to those numbers in just a bit, but I want to bring Ring Mayar in just right now. As a community leader, how did the Prime Minister's comments and other politicians' comments make you feel?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I would like to ask Kevin Bailey or the Prime Minister, Michael Turnbull himself, what does the word gangs constitute? It's very important for us to get a clear definitions. Calling the entire community as ganged, then we need to look at the structure of the gang itself. I mean, who are these people that are called gangs within my own community? These are young kids. Their ages ranges from 13 to 15 and 14 years old. If you look at their structures, they don't have resources. They don't have any clubs that they belong to. These are only young people getting up and just congregating and just going about their own life during the nighttime. But these are the particular group as singled out by the Prime Minister that we see as our own Prime Minister, somebody who's ahead of the country, the most beautiful country ever in this Southern Hemisphere, but yet it has concentrated so hardly on a very particular group with such a very small minority group. We are only 1% in the state of Victoria. So basically, the young kids that are labeled as gangs, they're not any different to any other mainstream Australian kids.
Okay, Kevin
And
Bailey,
we don't understand
why. What do you define as gangs?
Are
Are these just young boys out for a night out in the city, or are they an organized group with a particular objective at hand?
Gangs are when you get lots of young people getting together and getting up to mischief. Quite frankly, 13 and 14-year-old boys, 15-year-old boys shouldn't be hanging around the city late at night, whatever nationality they come from or whatever background they come from. One of the big problems that we've got is that our culture is created by what you reward and what you tolerate. And when you've got a group of young guys, particularly getting together in a group, that's what, in our country we tend to call a gang of kids or a gang of young people that are out there achieving, mischief or getting up to no good. So, the fact is that there has been a disproportionate number of these guys that have really been getting up to no good. And it's not the whole community. The whole community is not gangs. There are many, many, wonderful people in the Sudanese community, in the South Sudanese community, in African communities that are working very hard to support their communities. But one of the problems that I think, if we're being honest with each other, that there have been quite a number of groups of young people that have been doing some break-ins, that have been involved in mischief and so forth. It's just groups of young people, 5, 6, 10, 20 young people getting together is what we in Australia would call a gang of young kids.
Okay, Kevin Bailey, I'm going to have to press back on with some numbers, because you are creating this sort of this atmosphere of fear, or at least that's how it's perceived by some. Now, according to Victoria's Crime Statistics Agency, crime rates in that state have dropped nearly 9% in the last year, and Sudanese-born Victorians account for just 1% of all the crimes committed in the past year. Now, the flip side to that is that there's an overwhelming majority of the crimes committed, over 70%, are Australian-born Victorians. So it does sort of contradict what you just said.
Now, what we've got is 1% of our population in Victoria here are Sudanese, either first-generation or second-generation kids. And what has happened is when we look at the number of, for example, aggravated robberies that have occurred, about 8% of those aggravated robberies have been committed by Sudanese kids or young people. So the number 1% that you're talking about is not 1% of crimes, they're 1% of the community. And overwhelmingly, the number of crimes that are committed in Victoria, in Australia here, are committed by Australian people, of course, because this is Australia, and that's where the overwhelming number of people that live here are born here. And so we've got to address all crime. Every, migrant population that has come through, the Vietnamese, the Lebanese, many groups of people that have come here. We've been an incredibly generous country, welcoming many groups of people. And often that first or second generation has a real problem. One of the things that I'm concerned about, and I think the Prime Minister is highlighting, is the fact that many of these, we've had a very lax judiciary, we've had very lax bail conditions, and often police on the beat are trying to do a very, tough job. And these guys, they often have underage kids that are involved, and then they get out a revolving door. They get sent back out into the community very quickly. And so, we're really calling on the community to do a lot more, for their parents to do a lot more. They've got to be in control like any of us. We've got to be able to control our teenagers. We need fathers that are acting, in the best interest of the society, that are pulling their kids into line and not letting them get caught up in groups of other young men, because they often get led astray. It's not their fault.
Let me get an answer from Ring. Kevin Bailey was talking about there are other minorities, second, third generation minorities who don't experience this problem. The examples that he gave were the Vietnamese. Other examples that I can give are the Italians, the Greeks, the Turks. Are the South Sudanese or the Sudanese minority group sort of like the new kid on the block, and they're having this a bit more trouble in terms of transitioning into Australian way of life?
First of all, we don't dismiss the idea that my community have got some young people problems. We do have some problem within our community, and we don't condone any criminal behavior or any unruly behavior. But there's one thing that Kevin Bailey haven't spoken about it. He compared us to all other groups whom have arrived 50 years, 30 years ago to this country. Yes, they have first the brunt of what we are facing right now, but definitely we stand out in all these major groups. So now, and we do remember when our issue arises first, it arises during the John Howard era. That was the Liberal era. And the issue came out during the election time. And you, as your audience might know now, Victoria is facing an election within 3 months or 4 months' time. And there's no other cards that could be used to win the election for the Liberal. And it's quite unfortunate. My community has been marginalized, and particularly young people are feeling the brunt of marginalization and ostracizations and discriminations and outright racisms. And as a result, the entire community has been punished collectively by the Liberal, which is quite unfortunate, seeing our own Prime Minister, that the President whom I personally have apologized because he was called names in other times, but I've apologized because I believe the people who have elected him owe that apology, not to him, Michael Turnbull himself, and he has proven himself to be unworthy Prime Minister, coming out outrightly and calling my community as gang-ridden, when actually statistics doesn't collaborate that. We don't have a consensus to back up his claims. What I would like to say, people my age, you don't see them in that statistics.
Yeah. Kevin Bailey, let me ask you, isn't this rhetoric sort of ramping up racism? I mean, some groups are saying that racism has increased by 30% since this divisive debate has begun. On the flip side, too, the African-Australian community has been on the receiving end to it. Just this weekend, we saw this 19-year-old teenager being murdered. A father with a 10-year-old son was on the receiving end of abuse and maltreatment. So, is the problem here crime, or is it racism?
The problem is crime, and the trouble is that it's an easy out to call racism. Australia would have to be one of the least racist countries that I've ever come across. I've travelled throughout the world. We accept migrants, and we have been for many, many years. We've got lots of laws against people acting in a racist way. As you've mentioned, people of the Somali community have been the ones that have been victims to some of this crime that's been going on. 10 or 11 years ago, Mr. Mayor had mentioned that under the Howard government, the immigration minister, Kevin Andrews, called out this whole situation that was very, very serious. He said, we need to look at it. And the police commissioner and the Victorian government in our state gave him hell, saying that he was racist. They tried to make out that it was a terrible racist thing for him to be saying. And as a result of that, everything got swept under the carpet.
But Kevin Bailey, let me ask you, you say that Australia is one of the least racist comments, but so why does your party believe that some migrants' ideologies or values are not compatible with the Australian way of life then?
Right. The Australian, what we do is we accept people from all sorts of cultures, and we've got a very much a multiracial, multicultural society. But our culture was formed on the Judeo-Christian values, or the Western civilization that you'd be familiar with, that much of Europe, you know, with the concern for civil rights, the concern for democracy, dignity of the individual, respect for the police. Those sorts of values, the rule of law, have always been something that we've held very, very strongly as part of our culture. And so when people come here, we ask them to accept those beliefs and those cultures to actually fit in with the way of life that we have here.
Okay, my final question to you, Kevin, we don't have a lot of time, I'm sorry, but my last question is to you. You have upcoming elections in November in your state. Is it just easier to appear tough on crime, linking it to the African-Australian community, because being tough on the community, it just gets you votes?
I think the community standards are that the community is crying out to be protected, to have a better safety situation, for the police to be involved in really pulling this into line, for the community, in the Sudanese community, to actually take some action. And so, yes, it does help from that point of view, but also the current state government here in Victoria has been very soft on crime, and as a result of that, we've seen things get out of hand. It's not the Sudanese community's fault. It's the government's fault that has done the wrong thing in relation to not enforcing crime and encouraging or tolerating a situation where young people just see that they've got enough rope and they run as far as they can. That's just natural for young people of all.
I'm going to give you the last word. Kevin
Let
Bailey
me just
said
weigh in
it's going to be
briefly.
tough
Yes,
on crime. How does your community move forward after you hear comments like this then?
It's very unfortunate hearing from Kevin Bailey talking about being tough on crime. I believe the state of Victoria have done a marvelous job. The police is doing a great job. Kevin Andrews' government is the only premier that we have seen in our lifetime that have stood with our community firmly. Now, Daniel Andrew have tabled $8.6 million to transition these young people into a better life, meaning kids will stay more in the schools, kids will get employment, will get more training that is required for them to transition them to a better life and also to contribute into this country. We feel under this current government by Michael Turnbull, which is headed by Michael Turnbull, and people like Kevin Bailey and others and alike, actually is not helping my community at all. In fact, a fair income that most of Australians sink is sinking basically, is not really resonating in our hearts and mind. We feel we've been alienated and in fact we've been excluded and marginalized to that extent that we are used as a way of swaying opinions for people to vote for the Liberal. We don't vote Labor, we don't vote Green, we vote for somebody who will treat us better and give us a better opportunity in this country. And Kevin Andrew is doing that wonderful job.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. This has been it's a very heated issue. Thank you very much for an interesting debate. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Adijan Ayandar. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, farmers in Myanmar demand compensation for stolen lands. Can Aung San Suu Kyi deliver? Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.